So with that, I'll pass it over to Will and Ryan.
Okay. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. So can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So thank you all so much for joining today's webinar. Today, I'd like to talk about some really cool features that have been added to the Delta Sharing project over the past couple of releases. Most notably, Delta Sharing has been extended to support sharing Delta tables on Azure Blob Storage, AWS Gen 2, as well as Google Cloud Storage. So before I get into that, I did want to take a step back and give a brief introduction. So with us today, we have Ryan Ju, one of the co-creators of Delta Sharing. Ryan, did you want to give a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Will. So I'm currently a software engineer in Databricks. I joined Databricks in 2015, and I'm also a Apache Spark committer and PMC member. And currently, I'm one of the co-developers of Delta Lake, data sharing, and structured streaming. And then next, we'll hand over back to you. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. And just brief introduction about myself. My name is Will Girten. I'm a senior SSA at Databricks based out of New York. I earned my computer engineering degree at University of Delaware, go Blue Hens. I joined Databricks back in 2019, and since then I've helped some of our largest customers at Databricks build modern enterprise Delta Lakes in the cloud. My background is mainly data engineering and business intelligence. And then in a past life prior to Databricks, I helped a lot of federal customers based in and around the Washington, D.C. area build out their intelligent data lakes in healthcare and government verticals. So for those of you who are new to Delta Sharing on the webinar, I did want to take a step back and kind of briefly go over what the Delta Sharing protocol is, what are the main motivations behind it, and kind of get into how it works under the hood. So to begin with, Delta Sharing is actually the industry's first open protocol for securely sharing your data. And what that means is it's fully open. There's no risk of proprietary lock-in. It's not restricted to SQL, but it does support SQL. And if you're a Python developer, it also supports data science workloads as well. And because it's the secure data sharing protocol, it really allows you to easily manage your privacy, security, and compliance controls of your data as well. And just quickly, I think it's good to call out that Delta Sharing is released as a part of the Delta Lake project under the Linux Foundation. And from there, we can tap into kind of the vast open source community and kind of tap into the popularization of Delta. So also, kind of what are the motivations behind using Delta Sharing? Well, there's a couple problems worth solving. One is, being able to share your data across your organization or maybe across different companies or agencies if you work in the government vertical. So a lot of the times when I work with customers, I see two common patterns across customers when they try and share their data across the organization. One is that, say that they have their data and they've ETL'd it into a data warehouse vendor. Sometimes that data warehouse vendor will make it very easy to share the data across your organization, provided that you continue to purchase their data warehouse. So this is all well and fine as long as you and others continue to purchase the data warehouse vendor. So it's not very good as far as vendor lock-in. But perhaps maybe you have maybe a budget constraints or maybe a long procurement cycle, or maybe there's a different data warehouse vendor that promises more efficient, faster speeds. So this is kind of the more common problem that I see is that where say that there's a source data in the middle. What often I see are that teams will break off their own copy of the source data and kind of work in their own silo. And the main problem here is that as soon as you make a copy of the data, it immediately begins to diverge from that source. So the way to combat that is I see customers will build their own ETL pipelines to bring in the ETL changes, some of the incremental changes. There are all sorts of challenges around that as far as capturing deletes efficiently and accurately, applying those incremental changes. And more often than not, I see problems around data quality, data gaps. The worst problem being that, say that somebody has made a copy of the data and now they're incorrectly merging the incremental changes, and it's led to duplicates or maybe incomplete, inaccurate data. So the real solution here is don't copy the data at all. So that really is kind of the main motivation behind Delta sharing. And from some of the main goals that we've created for the Delta sharing project is one is that we wanted to be able to share the existing live data as it lands in your enterprise data lake. No need to copy it out, ETL it into a vendor. There's no need to have those brittle, long-running ETL pipelines. Just share your existing data without copying it, and you get real-time updates as they come in. The other main motivation behind the Delta sharing project was that we wanted to be able to support a wide range of clients. And we did that by using existing data formats like Apache Parquet, as well as made it very little friction for a data recipient, to be able to consume that data and go on with their day-to-day transformations in ETL. One other kind of main motivation behind the Delta sharing project was to be able to securely share your data. A lot of the times that data may contain sensitive elements, whether it's PII or PCI, for example. So the Delta sharing protocol has strong security, auditing, and governance built in as well. And then last but not least, we wanted to be able to scale out to massive data sets. And we'll see in just a second how we achieve that. But basically, there are a lot of use cases in all sorts of different verticals where the data sets being shared are in the terabytes or even petabytes of data. So these were kind of the main primary goals behind Delta sharing. So how exactly does Delta sharing work? Well, it begins with two parties, your data provider and then your data recipient. So it all starts with the Delta Lake being shared by a provider. And then in front of that is a Delta sharing server that kind of acts as the gatekeeper. It determines whether or not that data recipient on the right has access to a particular data set or subset of the data, and it enforces access to the actual data. And then on the far right is the data recipient, and they could use any sharing client that implements the Delta sharing protocol. It really is up to them what tool is most comfortable to work in, whether it's a BI tool like Tableau or Power BI, or maybe something around Python like Pandas or even PySpark. So that's really kind of the major elements of Delta sharing protocol. And how it actually works on the hood is, say that a data recipient wants to go and access or read some of the data that's being shared with them. So they'll begin by sending a request to the Delta sharing server. In this example, we have a data provider, say it's a retail provider, that's sharing real-time information about purchase orders. So say that this data recipient wants to do some sort of inventory or supply chain type of use case, they could quickly send a request to the Delta sharing server. And then from there, that Delta sharing server will check whether or not this recipient is authorized to access the data. And in this case, we can imagine that they do have access. And then from there, the Delta sharing server will go out and it will read the different files that have been persisted to cloud storage. And this doesn't necessarily have to be all of the cloud, all of the file objects. It could be a subset of the data as well, so that they only want to query a particular partition or date range. And then from there, the Delta sharing server will generate short-lived presigned file URLs and return that back to the data recipient. And in the past two releases, we've actually extended this to other cloud vendors as well, in particular Azure Blob Storage, AWS Gen 2, as well as in the latest release, Google Cloud Storage as well. So these, you can share your Delta tables across multiple clouds here. At the end of the day, the Delta sharing server will generate these pre-signed URLs for you, and the data recipient doesn't need to worry about any of the implementation details or where that data exists. It's really completely abstracted from them. And then, kind of on that fourth objective of Delta sharing is we wanted to be able to provide a protocol for sharing your data that would scale out to terabytes of data. And the way that we do that is we can take advantage of the cloud vendors themselves to be able to cost effectively and efficiently share the data and parallelize that read. So instead of the data traversing through the Delta sharing, those pre-signed URLs can be read in parallel using something like PySpark. And then also just kind of talk about the future roadmap, some of the upcoming features that will be added to the Delta sharing project. is a common use case is maybe you want to see all of the different changes that have happened to a shared data set. So in the future, we will also support being able to read the incremental changes from a shared data set as well. Okay, so that's enough talking. That kind of covers, what are the motivations behind Delta sharing and how it works on the hood. I wanted to get into an actual concrete example of using the Delta sharing project and kind of where play two different roles here as the data provider and data recipient. So in this example, I'm going to play the role of a data provider, say that I'm most comfortable with Python. I work as a part of a data science team, and I've created my data set, stored it out into multiple clouds here. And I like to provide this or share this data set to multiple recipients, whether it be a different team with my organization, or maybe it's a different outside agency or a different company. So it all begins with that Delta sharing server. So in this example, it starts with our Delta sharing server configuration. I've basically like to share two tables here. One is a sample COVID data set that has all the cases that have happened over time, as well as a second data set that has the cases with the agent included over time as well. So one is stored out in AWS Gen 2, and then the other is actually stored out in Google Cloud Storage. So in this example, I've created a Delta share called webinar share. And under that, I've created a schema called sample COVID data. And I'm sharing both of these tables, and both the data exist on two different clouds. So because I'm sharing one of my data sets out in AWS Gen 2, I need to include the access keys so that my Delta sharing server can generate those presigned file URLs. So the way that I do that for AWS Gen 2 is I create this core-site.xml file. It includes my key and secret. I install it into the configuration directory of my Delta sharing server. And then similarly for Google Cloud Storage, I've downloaded my key file as a JSON file. And then as I build my Delta sharing server, I can set an environment variable that will point to the location of that access key. So in this example, I've created a Delta sharing server that's running locally on my laptop, which is just fine for demo purposes. So that takes care of providing the data to recipients. So I'm going to theoretically change hats here and pretend I'm a data recipient as well. So say that I'm in a different team, on the analytics team within my company. I know that a different team has shared access to both these data sets. And it all begins with basically my sharing profile. And it's very simple. It's just a quick, short configuration file that includes the version of my credentials, the endpoint or location of my Delta sharing server, then lastly, my personal access token for accessing that data. And that's it. So now that I have basically the information for connecting to my Delta sharing server, I can use whatever syntax is most comfortable to me.
Hey, sorry, Will, can you do me a small favor and zoom in a little bit more? There's a YouTube, LinkedIn's noting the resolution's not as sharp, so if you can zoom in a little bit more so people can see the code base a little bit better.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
No worries. It's okay.
No
At least everybody knows that we're live, so it's not a big deal.
Let me bump this up. Is that better?
Yeah, it looks better. Thank you very much.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for letting me know. So just to recap here, I've got my Delta sharing server up and running locally. I've basically pointed to my two different data sets, and I've shared basically the credentials for accessing this data to my recipient. So I'm going to change hats here, pretend I'm a data recipient here. And I like to work with the data using Python. It's the tool that's most comfortable with me. And it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. I would like to basically point to this configuration file. I then create a sharing client that allows me to access the data and manipulate it. And then from there, I need to point to which table within that Delta share I would like to work with. So this example, I'm gonna load in the data set called time, which is COVID cases over time. I'm gonna load it into a pandas data frame because I like pandas API. I'm most comfortable with it. And then from there, I can basically, read those cloud files that are stored out in AWS Gen 2. I don't really care about the implementation details. In fact, I didn't even know that it's stored out in AWS Gen 2. I just know that there's a data set called time that's been shared with me. So this example, I've, in just a few seconds, it's reached out to AWS Gen 2, brought down the data and loaded it into memory. And I've displayed, just a subset of this. And then similarly, say that I want to also work with that table that's stored out in Google Cloud Storage. This should look very similar to the other one. The only thing that's really changed is the name of the table. So again, I'll go ahead and run this, read it in as a pandas data frame. And you'll see that this goes out, accesses the data from Google Cloud Storage and loads it into memory. Identical source code. The only thing that's changed is the name of the table, and all of the implementation details about where the data is actually stored, how to fetch it. It's all hidden from it. It makes it very, very simple to read your data, share it, and not have to have any friction about standing up your own server, sizing it out, really dealing with access permissions, things like that. And then I can also do a little bit more intricate things too as well. So say that I want to basically take these two data sets and join them together, maybe produce some sort of visualization or BI report at the end of this. I can also do that too, just use what's comfortable with me, in this case, Pandas API, to basically merge these two data sets together. And then also one other thing to kind of call out that's been released in the past 2 releases is this optional parameter here in your API for the Pandas API, and then also the PySpark connector, is the ability to load in maybe just a subset of your data set. Maybe your data set's huge and you only want to take a peek at your data set. You can pass in this optional parameter here called limit. Will limit the number of rows that are being loaded, and then display those out as well. So in this example, I've basically joined my 2 data sets together using Pandas, and I can display the contents here and in the tool that I'm most comfortable with. And then last but not least, say that I'm, maybe Python isn't the tool for me. Say that I'm a data analyst and I prefer using SQL. Just for illustration purposes only, I basically loaded that same those 2 tables again, and I'm using the Spark connector here in the Delta sharing project. And I can drop in my SQL that I'm most comfortable with here. I've just used Spark SQL here. I can drop in my ANSI SQL I'm most comfortable with. And then last but not least, one of the really cool improvements that we've added in the past couple of releases is the ability to quickly check whether or not you still have access to a share. If you recall in the architecture diagram, that Delta sharing server will generate short-lived URLs. So perhaps, maybe a couple of days have elapsed, and maybe you need to check whether or not you still have access to that shared data set. Well, we've made it very simple to check whether or not you still have access to a share. You can simply go out to your Delta sharing server and then consume this API endpoint, which is basically your Delta sharing server URL, shares, and then the name of your share. So I'm just sending a quick GET request here to check whether or not I still have access to this data set. Because I just loaded this, I just started this sharing server a moment ago, I still have access. But as you can see, if I just change the share name to something that's invalid, and I rerun this, you'll also notice that we've also improved the error messaging as well within the Delta sharing protocol in the past couple of releases. So in this case, I changed it to invalid share name, and it tells me, the error code here is that the resource doesn't exist, and I'm not able to grab this fictitious share called webinar share 2. So that's really, at a high level, how the Delta sharing server works under the hood, what are the main motivations behind Delta sharing project, and just kind of walked you through a couple of the cool features that have been added over the past couple of releases. So just wanted to pause here to see if we have any questions on the line.
Oh, sure. Actually, there are actually a lot of questions. So let me go ahead and chat through them. Some of them I was actually able to answer right away, but some of them weren't. So I figured if we got time for questions, let's go ahead and do that right now. So first from LinkedIn, there's a great question for Rohan is, where is this Python hosted? Like, the code that you're playing, and he's interested in knowing more about how to host the server, and can we do insert and update data as well? So let's break this down. Let's talk about where's the Python hosted, the code that you just showed first. Let me start with that.
Yeah, excellent question. So I'm just kind of work locally within the editor that I'm most comfortable with. So in that example, I'm using PyCharm locally on my laptop.
Perfect. Okay, and then they're interested in knowing how to host a server. So I was about to put in the sharing of the instructions on how to start the server yourself. So I'm going to do that right now. Do we support insert update of data as well? And we know the answer, but I figured I have one of you guys answer it. So.
Yeah, I can answer this. So basically, with the data sharing actually involve two parts. One is the data provider. The other one is like a data recipient. For data recipient, currently is read-only. You cannot modify the table that's shared to you. But for data provider, based on the table, they can do whatever operations on the data table using their, like, for example, storage credentials. And then but for data recipient part, this is just read-only.
Perfect. And then actually related to that, there's a question that came through on Zoom, I believe. Let me go ahead and find it here. Sorry, here we go. What type of authentication does the sharing server currently support? So we've talked about the presigned URLs from the standpoint of the of getting access to the data itself, but then in terms of how does the authentication work specifically with the open source sharing server? So could we provide a little context on that, please?
So the current open source data sharing server only supports like a token-based verification. So you define the API token in the server configuration file, and then all the recipient need to use this API token to talk to the server.
Perfect. We've got a lot of other questions, but I know that there's still plenty of stuff that you guys want to talk about. So why don't we switch back to the presentation? I'll do my best to answer the ones through the various channels. And then if we still have time later, I'll bring them back up for us to answer live, okay?
Yeah, sure. Just real quickly about that last question. I think we missed one about how do we install or deploy a Delta sharing server. So we've made it really, really simple. You can actually deploy this as a Docker container. You can run it in anywhere. And in fact, you don't need to build a Docker container yourself. If you just go out to the README, there's instructions on how to download a hosted copy of the Docker container from Docker registry. And you can basically use that to stand up your own your own Delta sharing server.
Perfect. Well, that's very helpful. And by the way, I have already, at least for the original author in LinkedIn, I've already pasted exactly where in the documentation how to set it up yourself. So.
Perfect. Awesome. Cool.
Back to you guys presenting, or is there anything
else?
So
that was the end of the presentation. So
sorry, I thought there's another section you were going to show. My apologies. Okay, well then let's continue on with the questions. My apologies for missing that cue.
No worries.
Let's see here. All right, so in that case, let me pull some of the older questions because I do want to actually call that out. Okay, for example, there's a great question: does Delta Sharing Server support the typical API gateway services like rate limiting, caching, local execution, for example?
Right now, the open source one doesn't support these features, but actually you can, for example, deploy the open source data sharing server behind the proxy, and then you can actually leverage the existing like open source proxy server to support all of these features. Actually, we have some like a customer actually is already doing like a deploy data sharing server like this, just behind the proxy to have like all the like a traditional like server capabilities. Yeah.
Yes, and one thing we always are up for, don't forget, okay, and we'll make sure to post this as well. join us at the Delta user Slack. Okay. There's a Delta sharing channel. You're more than welcome to join us there. And also, if you have some ideas about, for example, like you called out with the rate limiting part, yeah, we're always up for PRs. We love pull requests. So this is an open source project. So by all means, okay. So just wanted to call that out. All right, the next question is that, and I'll tackle this one myself, is that, do you plan to support ORC in addition to Parquet, right? And right now, and Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but Delta sharing itself, there's nothing actually inherently about Delta sharing that prevents it from happening. It's just that the vast majority of people are asking for the Delta tables, mainly enough the name probably helps with that, and Parquet. So that's what we're starting. Again, if there is a lot of interest from the community for ORC support, create an issue, create some PRs. We'd love to have the feedback. And just right now, at least, there has not, that while there certainly has been some people asking for it, honestly, it hasn't been that big. So that's the reason why it's not been a big community push yet. But you never know. Maybe if you prop it up and you'll be able to see what ends up happening, okay?
Yeah, I can also add one point.
Sure.
In order, if we plan, so basically the major issue of Parquet format is we need to do the file listing in the server. Imagine if you have a very big tables, then we probably will take like hours to list all the files in the table, which is not acceptable. That's why we use pick up Delta Lake in this Delta sharing protocol. And actually, you can do this like offline converting. For example, you can convert a Parquet table to a Delta Lake table easily using like open source Delta Lake project. And after that, for example, we don't need to list the files. We just read the Delta Lake transaction log to get all the files in the table and then generate the presigned URL, return to the clients.
Yes. So to overemphasize Ryan's point, basically, when we're talking about cloud object stores, because we're basically hitting web-based APIs, the listing of that is going to be erroneously painful, right? And so the Delta transaction log itself contains a list of files, so that way anything that's trying to access the Delta table knows exactly the path it's supposed to hit in order to get all that stuff, all the files, excuse me. Okay. So that's the reason why we're going down that route primarily. When you're hitting, for example, our Delta sharing server, the public one that we share for everybody to test it out, admittedly enough, there are not that many files inside there. So it's going to come back relatively quickly, whether you're talking about the transaction log or not. Okay. So Daryl, our friend Daryl also asked the questions like, hey, is there a way to handling schema drift as part of Delta sharing? Like, and at least in terms of our attempt to answer is like, well, that's why we have Delta tables in the first place, right? The Delta tables allow for both schema enforcement and schema evolution. So you can literally, as part of the audit history of a Delta table, you'll actually see all that information inside there right from the get-go. So Daryl, if you want to follow up with us, you're more than welcome to, but at least that's the context I'm trying to answer. We do have another question from Puyan from our Zoom link. The question was, they are trying to run this on a Databricks Community Edition, but it seems like it's not working. So honestly, you're not gonna love my answer, but I'm gonna tell you, if you can ping us onto the Delta sharing Slack instead, okay? So then the Delta users join in Slack and we can answer your questions there, just because there are a couple of things we probably have to go review first. And it's a little difficult for us to try to review these answers online right now. But if you can just chime us there, that'd be great, just because we will be able to help you out there. Again, the Delta user Slack, and specifically inside there's a Delta sharing channel. Okay. All right. Let's see. Right. Daryl did follow up with one of his questions which I thought was really interesting, was that he's wondering if there is the ability for eventually Delta sharing to be able to provide compute as part of the provider. Right now, there's no compute included within Delta sharing. Delta sharing is the file systems, and it's a service for authentication purposes, right? But there's no compute. So if you want to do filtering of the data or whatever else, right, it's done by the client. It's not actually done by the server. So is that something that we're considering doing, basically, which is to provide the compute capabilities as well?
That's a great point, actually. And so I think I'd suggest you to open an issue on the GitHub so we can discuss the details. regarding, for example, how to support the list. For example, since we discussed computer, we need to figure out how to run the computer. Where is the cluster we can use to run? Right? There are a lot of details. Probably it's better to discuss in, like, for example, a GitHub issue.
Yes. So exactly, Daryl. So Daryl's following with his Q&A, which is all the data is done by reading the client today. We are absolutely in agreement with you right now as the early beginnings of the Delta sharing. That's why we actually purposely did it this way. Just like Ryan called out, there are multiple potential approaches in terms of actually us offering compute as well. Usually what it comes down to is that there's also the factor of costs. Do you do this as a Docker VM that you spin up on your own, container? Then you have to incur the costs, what the egress costs that are associated with it. So because of all these different issues, there's actually a lot of good solid debates on that. So because of that, we definitely want to have the conversation in an open forum, like I said, like Ryan called out, in the GitHub issue, so we can discuss what do we think is the best route, right? And we can over time even produce a proposal that we all go work together to get that to figure out the best approach to that. Okay, so we actually still have lots of other questions, okay, by the way. So let me go ahead and switch over to LinkedIn, because right now I've been focusing mostly on Zoom. So let me go ahead and switch back to LinkedIn. Let's see. Sorry, I'm actually rolling back because I skipped a lot of questions by accident. So by the way, I'm going to start with these questions. If I missed your question on LinkedIn, please let me know and just type it again. I apologize. I was not trying to skip it. I just might have missed it as I'm scrolling, okay? So Srikant asked a good, solid question in terms of, is there a discovery API available to check which data sets or which tables are shared with me? And so Will or Ryan, why don't you go tackle that one?
There is, in fact. So yeah, the API, whether you use Python, for example, you could list out all of the tables that are within a share that's been shared to you, and you can quickly browse to see which data sets have been shared to you. And then you could use those cool limit parameters to just quickly peek at the data set rather than loading the full data set in memory.
Cool. I think that answers that perfectly. Next question is from Kayati. I apologize if I said your name incorrectly. Can you share how access permissions work on, like, for example, like a fine grain level? Is there access permissions to like the partitions of the Delta table that are available in Delta sharing right now?
Yeah, currently we don't have fine grain access control, but since this is an open source project, we would like to hear your feedback. You can create GitHub issue, and maybe if you already have some great idea, you can also open a pull request, and then we can work with you, and then to make sure we get this support in like future. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very common request, by the way. So absolutely follow up and look at the issues that currently exist, and or if they don't suffice, then absolutely we invite you to go create a new one. And then again, if you want to do a PR, we're always up for PRs. But the context is, yes, providing over time. Well, I'm not going to quote what the roadmap looks like right now. Yes, over time, that is absolutely something we're going to be working on. We're just, again, trying to, there have been many other requests that we've been tackling first at the end of like priority, namely the ones as part of today's webinar, as part of point 3, the Azure support, and point 4, the Google Cloud support, just because those were, there was a massive ask from the community for those things. So that's the reason why we've been focusing on that. Rohan also from LinkedIn did note that he would love to be able to do this from Node.js. I'm with you, buddy. I would love to do it with Node.js right now, but it's not an option for us. There is, by the way, a pretty cool project called Riverbank. It's an open source GitHub project that actually implements the Delta sharing protocol using, here we go, the Rust API. And so we can potentially utilize bindings with Node.js and everything else off of that. So whether you want to utilize Riverbank or you want to do a PR directly with Delta sharing, we'd love to have it. So not disagreeing with you, Rohan. Love the idea of Node.js, just simply saying it's not right. It's not, we haven't been, from a priority perspective, it's not there yet. Okay, so my apologies. Let's see. I'm going to read this other question. It's a good question from Mohit, but I just want to make sure I got it summarized correctly. Okay, I'll actually break it down to multiple questions. Okay, so in production, do we need to set up a VM that will act as a Delta sharing server? And so actually, I'll put it this way: in development, you will too. Okay, so if you want to set up your own sharing mechanism, that is correct. You will want to set up a VM of some type that basically goes ahead and acts as your Delta sharing server. I already popped in the instructions on how to do it, but just like Will had called out, there also is a Docker container that you can utilize as well. Okay. So now I'm going to this is specific to ADLS2 Gen 2. So probably for you, Will, if we are using ADLS Gen 2 and want to give access to a Delta folder, we can provide access to the folder in ADLS Gen 2. What additional benefit does Delta sharing provide? In other words, I can always just say, hey, here's ADLS Gen 2 and we're good to go. Why do I need Delta sharing to share that data?
Yeah, a number of reasons. Taking advantage of that Delta format. So being able to take advantage of the data skipping aspects, as well as like Ryan talked about. If you have a large data set where you need to regularly list out your objects, that is very inefficient. And then you also pay as a consumer for those API calls as well. So lots of benefits to using Delta sharing there.
Yeah, I think another pointer is basically if you share like your storage directory to another user, actually I need to use the specific like ADLS Gen 2 client to read. This means you need to let your customer or your user need to look for the support in different languages. For example, if they use Go, I don't know whether they are able to use Go to access or not right now. But right now data sharing is like purely like HTTP, which most of the languages will support HTTP like a client. And for example, if you can use HTTP client to talk to data sharing server, you will get a lot of like presigned URLs, which are also in HTTP format. And then you just use the same HTTP client to read this data. And so all the languages can support data sharing easily.
Right, and just to overemphasize Ryan's point, exactly because we're talking about web-based HTTP APIs, that question about Node.js, for example, right? Sure, we haven't built it ourselves, but it is using an HTTP API. So anybody who wants to build a pull request for Node.js to talk to it is relatively straightforward, right? And so that's the context, right? It gives you a lot of flexibility that even though you are setting things up in ADLS Gen 2, your client, your customers, don't require any access to Azure whatsoever. It's not a requirement at all. And even for those that do require Azure, perhaps you want a different mechanism to access that data that doesn't require specifically using ADLS Gen 2 shares, right? And for example, using a web-based protocol. Well, then again, this is the advantage of such an approach, right? So it gives you that right balance of extensive flexibility, yet still leveraging your scalable cloud storage. So that way, if there are that many more clients trying to access the data at the same time, you're still good to go, right? Because ADLS Gen 2 could certainly handle it. Okay?
Yeah, and also in addition, it's also about like a multi-cloud support. For example, in the future, you maybe move your data from ADLS Gen 2 to like a Google Cloud storage. And then actually the client doesn't need to change anything because everything are the same. They all use the same HTTP protocol to talk.
Perfect. Okay, so Vikash has actually asked a question that's a little close to my heart, which is, and I'm assuming I have a use case to consume a Delta table data with an analysis services model, an AAS model. Okay, so for some of you may or may not know, I actually used to work with the analysis services team, excuse me. Okay, so is this doable with Delta sharing? Now, not exactly yet because AAS by itself specifically doesn't do that, but there is a Power BI connector that connects directly to Delta sharing now. That's been in beta since, I want to say 2 months ago, I think. Now, but maybe I'm a little hazy, but so my apologies on the timing, but nevertheless, there is in beta a Power BI connector directly to Delta sharing. So you can definitely utilize Power BI to access that and perhaps use that as your ability to refresh the model. If you're working with the AAS team, and hi, everybody over there, if you want to go ahead and work with us directly to have AAS to talk directly, not even using Power BI to do it, glad to work with you. The protocol is straightforward. It's documented fully for that matter, so you're more than welcome to do it. And if you have questions, I'm going to pitch again. Delta the Delta user Slack. Join us in Delta sharing. Ask us questions there. We're more than willing to go ahead and help out with that process. Okay. So hopefully that answers your question, Vikash. And yes, my name is Danny Lee. You're more than welcome to ping me directly on the Delta user Slack, just because you're hitting close to my heart on this one. Okay. We've got probably time for just a few more questions before Karen tells me that I have to stop talking. So let me at least try to talk about those ones. Can we handle data type changes in addition of columns when writing a Delta table? Now, this is not specific to Delta sharing now, by the way. This is actually Delta Lake itself. And so Delta Lake itself allows for both schema enforcement, which basically prevents you to do any of these data type changes because you don't want to make those changes, and also allows you to go ahead and actually allows you to evolve your schema so you can make those changes. So when you're working with Delta sharing within the context of a Delta table, yes, you're good to go. Okay. Anything I missed, Brian, on that one?
Yeah, it looks good to me. Yeah. Yes.
All right. So, you know what? I think that's it for questions. I apologize, but I figured I know there's a lot more. So again, I'm going to answer my usual question. Join us in the Delta user Slack, Delta sharing channel. The three of us, and for that matter, others, are on there pretty regularly, and we will answer your questions. So Karen, why don't you close us up before I go ahead and take us completely off course?
Thanks, Denny. No, that's great. It's always awesome to see so many questions coming in, and yeah, I think the moral of the story is we'd love to have you join the Delta Lake Slack, and everyone's excited there to engage with you and answer your questions if we weren't able to get to them. I dropped a link to the Delta Lake Slack, so you have that there, and then also too for the recording is available right after this session. So with that, thank you everyone so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you so much, Will and Ryan. We loved having you as speakers on our meetup. So with that, thanks everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks
Bye.
all.